There have been big moves in the comic book industry in the past few weeks, but how do these moves affect your comics and your comic career specifically? My name is Gamal Hennessy. This is the comics industry commentary for June 4th, 2022, and we're going to talk about that right now. First, let's put things into a little bit of context. Earlier this week, Joe Quesada, the longtime chief creative officer for Marvel, editor-in-chief at Marvel, and the originator of Marvel Knights, decided he was leaving the company. And about 24 hours later, Bill Jemas, former publisher over at Marvel Comics and the president and publisher over at AWA, announced he was leaving that company to create a new company called Be Good Comics. Now, this comes on the heels of Frank Miller and Dan Didio announcing they were going to create a new comic book company called Frank Miller Presents. Now, there's going to be a lot of other videos, a lot of other commentary actually talking about, were these people good or bad for comics? Were they good or bad for their job? And a lot of other things like that. We're not talking about any of those things. What we're going to be talking about right now is, how do these moves actually affect you and your comics? Because depending on what type of comics that you create and what part of the industry you are in, a lot of these moves can have significant impact on what you're doing further down the line. Now, as we talked about in our earlier video, there are three core industries or three core career paths in comics when it comes to the actual comic book creation. You have your freelance, your independent, and what's called creator owned. Now, how all of these moves might impact the freelance comic book creator is fairly straightforward. If there are more comic book companies out there, then there are more potential places for you to find work. You may not necessarily be able to find work at one of these specific companies that just popped up, but as some talent kind of is gravitated towards those companies, other spots will open up that may not have been opened up before. And the idea that we have talked about before, especially here and at CPI, is that as executives and editors make moves from one company to another, opportunities may open up that weren't available to you before, and opportunities may close that you once had, because comics is a very small industry, and a lot of it is based on relationships. So if a person, your main connection, your main into that company was a specific person, that person moves, well, now you may not have the same leverage inside that company. And it works the other way. Somebody comes into a company that you already know and have a relationship with, you may now have a new opportunity that you didn't have in the past. When you're talking about creator-owned books, there may also be opportunities there depending on how some of these comic companies are structuring their deals. If they're only doing freelance work, like a Marvel or a DC, then you're not going to actually get any new work or any new opportunities to put your book in those companies, because they're not going to allow you to own any piece of the intellectual property. But Frank Miller, I'm almost positive, he said at least part of that line is going to include creator-owned books. And when Bill Jemas was at AWA, part of that line included creator-owned books. So there is a possibility, I have no inside knowledge, I do not know what their business model is, that they're going to offer creator-owned deals, which would actually create more opportunities overall for the creator-owned comic book publisher. Now, when that happens, you have to keep in mind that you still need to get a good deal. Just because you got a deal does not mean it's a good deal. So more opportunities may not necessarily mean better opportunities. And for the independent comic book publisher, I think the impact is going to be more widespread over time, because as more and more of these comic book publishers pop up, they raise the profile of comics overall, especially if you look at what's happening with a lot of celebrities in other media moving into comics. Wesley Snipes is putting out graphic novels. Oscar Isaac is putting out graphic novels. Alicia Keys, Colin Kaepernick. There was Keanu Reeves last year with berserker. So as more and more people bring their specific audiences to comics, you have more and more people reading comics overall. If you are making independent comics, you can, depending on how you position yourself in your marketing, ride that wave and actually increase your sales over time. So while what's ultimately going to happen with Quesada and Jemas and Miller and all of these other people remains to be seen, the main thing that you should think about if you're a comic creator is how all of these moves are going to actually impact your comics and your career, and not necessarily worry about a lot of other stuff, because you already have stuff to worry about. So that's going to be it for this commentary. I want to know what you think about all of these major moves, and especially how it's going to impact your comics. And until next week, have fun with your comic.